Right, everyone. Hello, welcome to this webinar on another very nice Cambridge evening. It's been a very sunny and beautiful day. My name is Marina. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute, and you're joining us at a webinar that is jointly organized by the Wolf Institute and by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, with partners in CSIC and IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Leicester Medieval Research Center, and Ghent University. So many of you will be quite familiar with these webinars, but for those who are not, I'll introduce the two main host institutions. The Wolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our teaching with public education, with policy work, and with academic teaching. Please have a look at our website and the YouTube channels to learn more about our work. Now I put on my other hat as Vice President of the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. The society was founded in 1997 and it's dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. And this is also the moment when I always introduce the journal of the society, which is Al-Mazak. The journal is part of the subscription for the society, so when you become a member, you get this sent to your house every 3 months. It's a very, very nice journal, and we're also always inviting article entries to the submissions to our journal, which has a very, very quick turnover as well. Very quick introduction of how this webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience, and we're also live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to recommend it to anyone to watch, it will be available from the Wolf Institute Facebook page very soon. And it's also then later available from the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. Our topic for the day is archives and record keeping in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I've been looking forward to this very much, as one of my big academic heroes, Professor Marina Rustow, is on board with us today. And our chair today will be Alessandro Silvestri, who then will in turn introduce all the speakers. So the panelists will present for 10 minutes each, and then there will be a short discussion among the panel while you can prepare questions for the Q&A session, which we'll have afterwards. Please type your questions in the Q&A box in the portal, Q&A portal, rather than the chat, because then it's much, much easier for the chair to handle the questions. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Alessandro. Alessandro, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm happy to chair this session, and I'm very grateful that our speakers accepted to participate, and I'm sure they will help us to understand a word that for many of us is unknown. I think we'll proceed according to a chronological order, and we'll have firstly Marina Rustow, and then Benedict Ryer, and finally Daisy Livingston speaking. I will introduce each speaker just before the talk, so that you will remember who is speaking, who's done, and something more about his specialization. Marina Rustow is Keduri Zika Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East at Princeton University and Director of the program in Near Eastern Studies at the same university. She's a social historian of the medieval Middle East, with a main focus on the history of archives documentation in Egypt and Syria from the 10th century to the 15th century. She's author of several books and essays, and just mention at least the monographs Heresy and the Politics of Community, the Jews of the Fatimid Caliphate, published for Cornell University Press in 2008, and The Lost Archive, Traces of Caliphate in a Cairo Synagogue, which has been recently published by Princeton University Press. Marina, whenever you want to start, the floor is yours. I think you have a PowerPoint to share, Grant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, and thank you, Miriam, for organizing this event and for the introduction. And thanks, Daisy Livingston, also, without whom this wouldn't have happened. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about archiving in the context that I work on, which is the Fatimid Caliphate. And because not everybody knows about the Fatimids, I'll just start off with a map. So what you see on this map in the kind of blue or lavender, depending on what you call that color, are the Abbasids. And everybody's heard of the Abbasids. The Abbasids ruled from Baghdad between 750 and 1258. But not everybody has heard of the Fatimids, who were a kind of rival caliphate in the West. They started off in Central North Africa in the early 10th century, declaring a caliphate in 909. And by the end of the 10th century, this was the transformation that the Eastern Mediterranean had undergone. So now pretty much the entire Islamic Mediterranean, with just a couple of exceptions, was under the rule of the Fatimids. So that's why they're important, especially in the 11th and 12th century. The Fatimids are also important because they founded the city of Cairo. When they arrived in Egypt in 969, the residential core, right at the beginning of the Nile Delta, was Fustat, which was built on the ruins of a Roman fortress. But when the Fatimids arrived, they founded their Palatine complex just north of Fustat, and they called it Al-Madina al-Qahira, the city victorious, which we anglicize via Italian actually as Cairo. So this is just to kind of show you one of the monumental structures that they built. This is part of the city walls, which you can still see today. So essentially what I showed you was that the Abbasids are here on the right of the map, and then the Fatimids take over the Mediterranean. This is Fatimid Cairo and the Monumental Gate. And then I was just about to show you the residential core just south of Cairo is Al-Fustat. So if you zoom in on Fustat, you can see that there are a number of medieval religious buildings that still exist there that you can visit today. In the yellow, you have churches. In the green, you have mosques, and in the blue, there's a synagogue here, the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And the Ben Ezra Synagogue is was built in the 11th century, was totally rebuilt in the 19th century, and as a result of the rebuilding, what was discovered was a chamber containing lots of worn manuscripts, dating from the 10th century all the way through the end of the 19th. Most of those manuscripts were in Hebrew script, but there were also plenty of Arabic script manuscripts as well. Fascinatingly, because the people who studied the Geniza were primarily looking for material in Hebrew script, and because the Arabic was undotted and difficult for people to read, and also the scribes who wrote Arabic documents were averse to lifting the pen off of the page because, you know, what a waste of time. Much of the Arabic script material was initially cataloged as scribbling, when in fact it wasn't scribbling. In many cases, the Arabic documents were actually state documents. So this is kind of where the plot thickens. So this is like a typical example of an Arabic state document. In this case, it's a Fatimid decree that was cut into pieces. So you can see the Arabic has very wide line spacing, which is typical of these decrees, cut into pieces and then used to form pages of a quire, on which the scribe wrote a section from the Babylonian Talmud, one of the major works of rabbinic Judaism. And there are lots of such fragmentary decrees that survived in the Geniza. So here's another example. This one was reused for a Hebrew calendrical text between the lines. It's frustrating that most of the decree fragments are fragmentary, so you don't really have a sense of the grandeur of what these documents once were. But my colleague Ronnie Shweka actually found a fantastic sort of set of puzzle pieces that fit together to form 1 meter, 23 centimeters of a Fatimid decree, which, from what I can reconstruct of the text and the formula and the structure, based on other documents, was probably about 8 meters long. So these things would be quite grand and quite large. So the question is, why were they simply either thrown away as scraps or chopped up or reused for other kinds of documents? Didn't the Fatimids have some kind of an archiving system? So it turns out that they did, but in order to understand how it worked and how these decree fragments fit in, you have to kind of zoom in on the actual process of producing a decree. This is also a Fatimid decree, but as you can see, it's very different from the ones that I've just shown you because it's not a long vertical scroll, rather it's a bifolio, so folded in half at the center, meant to be stored folded. This was one that was discovered by Geoffrey Kahn in 1986, and it turns out to be a kind of smoking gun to understand this whole problem. There are many sections to this decree, and you sort of have to understand how they fit together in order to figure out what the process is. So here in the corner is a summary for the archivist, essentially, so the archivist knows what's in the decree without actually having to read the entire thing. Then beneath that, you have an administrative header basically saying what kind of a document this is and the fact that it's been registered. And then you have this, does not really look like a word, but it is a word. It says nuqila in Arabic, which means it has been copied. And what that means is that this decree text that you're looking at before you has been transferred to a long vertical support, to a rotulus. So it's become one of the big grand decrees that I showed you before. So what that means is that this archival version of this Fatimid decree was written before the long vertical scroll. And I'll tell you why that's important just in a moment, but there's one more piece to look at, which is this is a heading that uses a different word for copy. And the word for copy here, nuskha, means that this is actually the canonical text. This is the text that was meant to be archived for posterity and also was the kind of Platonic model that would then be copied onto the grand vertical scroll. So these are all the sections kind of put together. You can see there's quite a bit going on this page. And all of it would have kind of, signaled in this semiotic way what the whole procedure was and what the document in fact was. If you compare the size of these two documents, this is more or less the size comparison. Here's another version of the size comparison. So you can see that this is a much more sensible and compact version of the decree that a kind of, practically minded archivist might prefer to store rather than this very, very large thing that was meant to be rolled up. So here I have a wonderful animation that you will not be able to see, but I will try to reproduce it somehow. So this is the scribe who's responsible for producing these bifolio decrees that I just showed you for the archive, the clean copy. So he is called a nasikh in Arabic, and he's responsible for producing the nuskha that I showed you. So once he's finished writing out the canonical version, he will pass that on to the calligrapher. And the calligrapher is the guy who writes this grand scroll here. Once he's copied it out from this nuskha, from this archival copy, the calligrapher then passes it on to the archivist, who's called the khazin. So how do I know this? I know this because I scoured the one depiction that we actually have, the one verbal description we have of the Fatimid chancery and how things worked there. And when I finally was able to make sense of all of it and work the original documents into this description, it actually all fit together perfectly, which was completely delightful. So what that means is that this grand decree, although it looks absolutely amazing to us and would have been very impressive to the people who were hearing it read aloud or looking at it, I mean, look at that wasted space. This is clearly the, conspicuous consumption of the government saying, we're the government, we can use as much paper as we want. In fact, what this is a very ephemeral kind of performance instrument. So in my book, The Lost Archive, I actually compare it to Pete Townshend's guitars. The idea being that it's all the more impressive because you destroy it after the performance. So what's fascinating is to see the variety of uses for which these decrees were then later reused. This is a trader who's written letters on 3 different Fatimid decrees. And we actually know when the letters are dated to, and we know when one of the decrees was dated to. This decree must date to after 1131 because it mentions a particular Fatimid caliph. And the letter that he's written over it, he wrote between 1139 and 1140. So that suggests that there was actually a very tight turnaround time between the production of these grand rotuli and their being chopped up and kind of reused. And that was kind of the first, clue in my mind that, okay, something's going on here where maybe these things aren't quite as important as they look, at least not in the Fatimid archiving system. There are lots of other reuses. So in this case, this is a Fatimid decree that was reused for Greek texts. So it wasn't just Jews who were doing it for Hebrew texts. There are also examples that are reused for Arabic. In this case, this may be a Fatimid decree. It could also be a Norman document because the Normans imitated the Fatimids in many respects, including the writing of documents. And this one has some Latin in addition to Arabic. And this was reused for a notarial register by an Italian notary, Giovanni Scriba, whose notebook was published in the 1930s. So he's kind of like well known among people who work on Latin notaries. But this was also, this reusing decrees was something that even extended beyond the confines of the Islamic world. So this is a 10th century decree from Dunhuang in Western China. And it's a royal decree, a royal edict, giving permission for the 10-year-old daughter of an official to enter a monastery. And it's been reused for a Buddhist liturgical text, a dharani, which is like a kind of the essence of a sutra. This is like, apparently something that isn't particular to the Islamic Middle East. So when people say, oh, the Islamic Middle East, we don't really have archives from there, that doesn't mean that archives didn't exist. And the fact that you see these fragmentary decrees doesn't mean that there was a kind of disrespect for documentation, merely that we have to understand how documentation worked in order to judge what the archiving system really was.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you for your fascinating talk. It would be great to listen more, to be honest, but it's a start. I think I know that we don't have so much time for discussing now, but I wanted just a clarification before moving to Benedict Reyer. I was just curious about the materiality of documentation. Is there a mixed use of paper and parchment in the?
So Fatimid state documents are written only on paper. So this is also something that's perplexing from the point of view of people who study Christian European documentation, because it seems that parchment is kind of the more expensive support. And it's also true in the Islamic world that if you wanted to write a very expensive book that maybe was commissioned, for a professional scribe to write, that often would have been on parchment as well. But for government circles, paper seems to have had a particular kind of meaning and a kind of prestige, especially large format paper. So there too, the assumptions that we might come with from Christian European contexts about what the meaning of paper is don't quite apply in this case.
Perfect, thanks. But given that I come from Sicily, I think traditions are closer to Northern Africa for the use of paper, at least. That's interesting, but we immediately move to the second talk. We have Benedict Reyer from Hamburg University. Benedict studied Middle Eastern studies in Hamburg, Birzeit, and Berlin, later gaining his PhD at the Berlin Graduate School, Muslim Cultures and Societies in 2022, with a thesis entitled Documents in Books, Archival Practices in Medieval Arabic Biographical Dictionaries. In the meantime, he worked as a research associate at the Institute of Islamic Studies, and he is currently a research associate at the Cluster of Excellence Understanding Written Artifacts at the University of Hamburg, leading the research project, The Archival Topography of Medieval Jerusalem, Record Keeping in a Provincial Town. Among his most recent publication, the essays Bibliophilia in Ottoman Aleppo, Muhammad al-Takawi and his medical library for their Islam, and the forthcoming essays, The Reception of Jihad Literature in the Crusader Period, which will be published soon by the academic journal Crusades. I'm sorry for my horrible pronunciation of Arabic words, but Benedict, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, Marina has wonderfully shown us how administrators in Fatimid Egypt were involved in the preservation of documents. And the archive she's working on is the proto-state archive, in which political and military actors preserve the documents they issued in the management of their dominion. One thing that is emerging in the last couple of years of research is that archiving was a practice involving a multitude of practices and actors, not only in elite institutions such as the political and military authorities, but also various religious communities, households, and countless individuals. So the archival landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean was certainly a very diverse landscape, and we are only slowly getting a clearer idea about all the intricacies. What I want to present today is an example of an individual who maintained an archive. His activities belong to a little researched set of archival practices that was quite popular among Muslim scholars in the medieval Islamic lands. The archive I'm concerned with is not a room or a box filled with documents, but one that comes in the material manifestation of a book. Muslim scholars used different kinds of books for archiving their achievements and those of others. And I will talk about one particular type of book today, a book called Thabat in Arabic, and this can be translated in our context as register book. Now, in this type of book, scholars retain proof of their activities. What was preserved in these books were not the initial documents, but modified copies or transmediations of those documents, and we will see what this actually means in a minute. But before, we need to look into the paper trail initiated by the transmission of knowledge to get a better idea what these archival books were all about. Now, the process of transmitting knowledge among Muslim scholars was quite a simple thing. There were at least two persons involved. One was the transmitter, a person who earlier in life had obtained the right to transmit the given text in an oral transmission session by an earlier authority who in turn had obtained the right to transmit earlier, and so on, until they reached the author of the text. Or in the case of the transmission of hadith, the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet himself. The other person, or the larger audience, were on the receiving side. Now, the given text was recited or read out loud, and in the end, the transmitter issued a permission to transmit the text through his chain of transmission. To this end, an audition certificate, Sama'a in Arabic, was written on a copy of the text that was present at the session. And what we can see here is one such example. This is a page appended to a short collection of hadith, which carries a total of 28 of these audition certificates. And we can see two here. One is here, and the other one written by a different hand is down here. In the framed certificate, a certain Kamal ad-Din Ishaq ibn Abi Bakr al-Nahas, marked in green, transmitted the text based on a permission he had obtained from a certain Ibn al-Kumayra, marked in blue. The text was read by the famous scholar al-Dhahabi, marked in orange, to an audience of 10, here in yellow. And the writer of the certificate identifies himself as a certain Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Wani, here in red. And he provides the date and location, a day in late January 1307 in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, here in gray. Now, the crux of all this is that this document was issued once only, and the individual audience members did not receive a take-home certificate of the permission. And the manuscript on which the document was issued was likely to be out of reach for most of the audience after a short while. To remedy this fact, scholars who were serious about their careers kept track of each and every permission to transmit they obtained throughout their long careers or years of study in archival register books. The National Library in Damascus preserves a part of a register book of Al-Wani, the writer of this very certificate. In this manuscript, Al-Awani diligently preserved the permissions he obtained from 1305 to 1316. And thanks to the detail he provides, we can track his travels from Syria, Egypt, and Hijaz to the day. Zooming in, we can see that Al-Awani created entries in chronological order for each session he took part in. I call these session entries. In such a session entry, he registered those components of the initial audition certificate that were relevant for him to retain a proof of his activities. The session entry matching the above shown audition certificate shows that these components were first the name of the transmitter, in our case Al-Nahas, here in green again, the title, or in this case, the two titles transmitted in the respective session, here in pink, each followed by the chain of transmission through which he was now allowed to transmit these titles to the next generation, here in rose, followed by the name of the reciter, Al-Dhahabi, again in orange, date and location in gray, and finally, and this is quite interesting, his signature in turquoise. Now, comparing the initial audition certificate with the entry in Al-Awani's register book, we can see two major changes. The first is Al-Awani omitted the names of the audience, as these had no value for his personal archive. Second, in contrast to the certificate, he added the full chains of transmission, which were highly meaningful in this period as a way to establish a spiritual bond to the Prophet. And who wants to know more about this whole process should read David Gerritson's recent monograph carrying on the tradition. Now, what was the impetus lurking behind these archival register books? I think it's safe to say that the idea was to preserve the permissions to transmit for later retrieval. As we can see in the case of Al-Awani, scholars like him often traveled from city to city and participated in transmission sessions whenever and wherever they could. The initial documents were single-issued, and in order to keep track and preserve their scholarly achievements and thus their credentials and their status, scholars maintained archival register books. As I said in the beginning, the Thabat was only one step of preserving transmission documents, but the story actually goes on, and the transmission documents were further processed into other books with an archival function, but we have no time today to talk about these other books. And to slowly come to an end, I hope to have given a brief impression of one particular archival practice carried out by Muslim scholars in the Eastern Mediterranean. What we can see in these books is the tireless urge to systematically preserve and make retrievable their obtained permissions. Sorry, my nails are just starting to drill again. Now, what is most interesting with this practice is that it was a highly popular practice, and it was also a highly personal practice. We only start to understand it and need much more research to excavate the intricacies of individual scholars, to see what exactly they preserved and in which way they made the information containing in their archival register books retrievable for themselves and for others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benedict, for your talk. And as I said before, I immediately have a question for you, which is more like a clarification, because you, during your talk, used alternatively the terms of register and book. I was wondering if there is actually a difference in to your opinion, or that you are using these two terms as they have the same meaning?
Sorry, which two?
The terms register and book.
Yeah, well, it's a synonym in my case here. Synonym is register, or register book is in my case here the same.
Okay. All right. Okay, next speaker is Daisy Livingston, which, well, it's years I know her since she was a PhD student at SOAS. Currently, Daisy is a postdoctoral researcher at the Cluster of Excellence, Understanding Written Artifacts at the University of Hamburg. and she's working on a project focusing on a corpus of late Mamluk Arabic legal documents, which were preserved in the Karaite synagogue of Cairo. She's also in the process of completing a book adapted from her PhD thesis entitled Managing Paperwork in Mamluk Cairo, Archive, Waqf and Society, which will be soon published by Edinburgh University Press. And last but not least, she will soon take up the position of Assistant Professor of History in the period 900-1250 at Durham University, and this is, I think, super good news. Thank you, Daisy, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, good. Yeah, so with this, I'm going to kind of move back to Cairo, which Marina was focusing on geographically, but staying in the Mamluk period and staying, like Benedict, on archival practices that are sort of taking place outside the specific context of the state or the chancery, or however we like to talk about it. So instead, I'm going to consider a different venue for the preservation of documents, in this case, religious endowments, or al-Waqf, waqf in the singular. So with 10 minutes, I thought it's best to outline a single case study. So I'm going to focus on a single endowment archive from the end of the Mamluk period. So a little bit of background on Waqf endowments and what they involved. So they're often presented as one of the defining institutions of medieval Islamic societies, and they were widespread across the Near and Middle East and beyond. These endowments involve the donation and immobilization of property, which the benefits of which would then go to support a charitable or pious cause. So rents from commercial or domestic property, for instance, might be used to support the construction and maintenance of a mosque, a madrasa, a Sufi hospice, a primary school, public drinking fountain, etc. The proceeds of endowments could also be donated to the descendants of the founders, which was a convenient way to provide for family members, particularly in the later Mamluk period, for the descendants of an elite whose membership wasn't primarily defined by dynastic principles. And Waqf endowments paid for the construction of many of the medieval buildings that still stand in Cairo today, including the one on the slide. So they represent, Waqf endowments represent a key lens through which historians of the Mamluk period have hoped to understand many different aspects of Mamluk society. And one of the reasons for that is because of the huge numbers of Waqf-related documents that have been preserved in modern archives in Cairo today. So turning to archiving, in one of the modern archives, in Cairo, the Historical Archive of the Ministry of Endowments, we can find traces of a substantial Waqf archive, that of the penultimate Mamluk Sultan, Qani Sawh al-Khawri. So a little bit of background on him. He ruled between 1501 and 1516 CE, and he earned a pretty damning reputation in the contemporary chronicles, particularly that of Ibn Iyas, who judged him harshly for expropriating property expropriating property in the Mamluk capital. So in 1516, he died in battle against the Ottomans in Syria, probably of a stroke. And his successor, Tuman Bey, his nephew, ruled only 6 months before the Ottomans arrived in Cairo, spelling the end of the Mamluk period and also the end of a long period where Cairo was a political capital. So al-Khawri was the last Mamluk Sultan to rule for an extended time, but he was also the last Mamluk Sultan to make a large endowment, in this case to benefit a funerary complex comprising a mosque, a madrasa, primary school, public drinking fountain, and a Sufi hospice, as well as the Sultan's tomb. And the print on the slide is an image of his complex, which still stands in Cairo today. So the documents that make up his Waqf archive are legal deeds, which record the status of property. And they were produced by legal notaries under the heavy oversight of qadis, who undertook extensive certification procedures to establish the legality of the transactions that they recorded. Al-Khawri's Waqf archive was composed of 2 distinct kinds of deeds. which I would separate from each other by their different relationships to the Waqf endowment and to the moment of creating the Waqf endowment. So on the one hand, we have endowment deeds themselves, and these are deeds that outline all the details of the endowment, what property was being endowed, what the proceeds of the endowment were intended to benefit, and the legal conditions that were laid down by the endower, in this case, Al-Khawri. And so he made several large endowments over the course of his reign, which are recorded in a number of different deeds that survive. The largest by far were 2 endowments that he made to support his funerary complex, and the dates of those 2 endowments are on the slide. The last of those was just 3 months before his death. So that's the first kind of document that is in the Waqf archive. The other kind is smaller documents which would pertain to individual properties that ended up in the endowment. So these documents actually make up the bulk of the documents in Al-Khawri's Waqf archive and number around 260 separate documents. There are a larger number of documents that pertain to property that he owned, but some of them it's not clear whether the property itself entered the endowment. So these were documents that were originally produced to record other transactions, sales, for instance, and they were updated at the time when the property was placed in Al-Khawri's endowment to record this. So some of them date from considerably earlier than Al-Khawri's, well, than the moment of his endowment, and indeed than his reign, with the oldest of them dating some 50 years before he came to power. So these are documents that had rather extended and often quite dynamic lives as evolving records of individual properties, as the properties changed hands over the years, and the documents were updated to reflect that. So the 2 different kinds of documents that I've outlined here have slightly, so that basically a different sort of chronological relationship to the endowment. The endowment deed was produced at the moment that the endowment was made, while the older, smaller deeds were gathered in the process of purchasing property for an endowment, which suggests that the process of both forming a Waqf endowment and producing a Waqf deed also involved a significant process of document assembly and rationalization. With the exception of one Ottoman copy of a Waqf deed, which I don't have time to discuss here, the documents in Al-Khawri's Waqf archive are scrolls of varying length. The overwhelming majority are, as Marina mentioned, written on paper, high quality paper, though some of the older documents that ended up in the archive were written on parchment, and legal documents were still written on parchment in this period, in the 15th century. I can tell from a rather anecdotal impression of what exists in the collections today. The largest Waqf deed, which was contained the deeds for the 2 endowments that I had the dates for in the previous slide, is a particularly monumental deed reaching around 30 meters in length. Unfortunately, the images on the slide are not of that deed, but it gives some kind of impression anyway of what these documents look like. The property-related scrolls are smaller, but they still reach several meters in length, which is a phenomenon that's largely accounted for by the extensive descriptions of property that appear on the documents, but also titles of the names of people who are mentioned, and also extensive cross-referencing of other documents. So this cross-referencing phenomenon is something I'm going to very briefly dwell on, because it's a feature of the archive that I find particularly fascinating, as it demonstrates the enormous amount of scribal effort that went into producing and updating these scrolls, but also the way this mass of documents together functioned as an archive of the endowment and the properties that constituted it. So it was the Waqf deed itself that was the central object, and indeed we have indications that these deeds also served symbolic and ceremonial functions. So in some deeds, it's stipulated that the entire deed should be read once a year in front of the community of the endowment. And there are chronicle accounts of Waqf deeds being paraded through the streets of Cairo. But the Waqf deeds owed the legality of their contents to the extensive cross-referencing of the older, smaller property deeds, which they cited when they outlined the details of the property which entered the endowment, because it was a legal necessity for any property that somebody endowed to be obviously legally in their ownership as private property. So they had to prove that, and they did that with reference to these older deeds. So in Al-Khawri's case, the circa 260 document archive of property-related scrolls was a kind of backup archive, which supported the Sultan's claim to each of these individual properties in case of legal challenge. And this function was supported by the addition of filing notes, which I unfortunately don't have any images of here, which were written onto the outside of scrolls to make it easier to locate the records of particular properties. It's often been assumed that there's a privileged relationship between Waqf endowments and practices of long-term archiving. These endowments, which are, as I said, are widespread all over the Islamic world, were made at least theoretically in perpetuity, which seems an encouraging precondition for long-term preservation of records. It's also been argued that Waqf constituted something akin to a legal personality, meaning that endowments led to the emergence of corporate interests of a kind that's usually considered to be lacking within Islamic law. So this meant that there were groups invested in the endowment and its success, not to mention architectural foci, such as madrasas, which could serve as sites of document storage. In late Mamluk Cairo, it seems that Waqf was one of a number of property-related practices that did indeed feed into a kind of documentary acquisitiveness, which I've hinted at here in my discussion of Al-Khawri's nearly 300 scroll archive. Still, I would argue that it's only when we really deeply root these archives within their historical specific context that we can come to understand the particular interplay between Waqf and archiving in specific contexts. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that Al-Khawri's Waqf archive constitutes a frozen archive whose preservation in its current state can't really be seen to reflect Mamluk era practices or Mamluk era intention for long-term preservation. But by outlining this example here anyway, I've sought to present rather rapidly some of the techniques that were used to make this corpus into a functional archive. So I'm going to stop there. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Daisy. Well, I immediately have a question also for you, which is like, I imagine it's not by chance that among the documents which were preserved, there are documents pertaining to transactions, economic affairs, and with, as you mentioned, also cross-referencing among scrolls. Am I right? Is the reason connected just to the reason for preserving documentation connected to, I mean, economic reasons and attesting properties?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very clear, it's very obvious to us to understand why a document which records property rights would be preserved, at least for some period of time. I mean, I guess that's the real question is the length of time. But yeah, I think you're right that there's quite an obvious incentive to preserve this kind of record because of, well, A, the value of the properties, I guess, but also the legal status that the documents are recording. So that will be, I guess, a very basic answer to your question.
It was just a quick clarification. And before moving to the questions from the audience, and I remember you should use the Q&A box just below our faces. I have a very general questions for all of you. As a scholar of Western, I mean, at least of the Mediterranean, medieval Christian Mediterranean, I'm used to have huge amounts of documentation preserved in archives, and we also know roughly well why and for what reasons sometimes archives were destroyed by fires or because of wars and so on. Could you tell us something more about why in the Arabic Muslim world of the Mediterranean documentation has not been preserved, but for just a few casual exceptions?
I can maybe get us started on that. So one thing it's important to keep in mind is that almost all the archives that we have were put together after the fact, in many cases by modern governments. So that's, you know, that's the first thing. And now it's also true that those modern archives contain other archives. So if you kind of did a survey of all of the archives that you knew to have existed in Christian Europe and all the ones that exist today, you would find an enormous amount of precisely this kind of attrition. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind is, I think many of us, when we think about archives, have some very exceptional cases in mind. So to take the Italian case, for instance, there are archival documents in Italy that go back to the 4th century, which, you know, I think boggles the mind for pretty much anybody. But Italy seems to have been a very particular kind of archiving culture. And the archiving in Italy was also facilitated by the fact that there were so many different governmental structures over kind of small, relatively small spaces. So it's, you know, important not to generalize that and kind of imagine that that's the norm against which we compare the.
Daisy, you want to go first? Okay. So, I mean, in my case, or in the cases I'm working on, the question is not really, like, I can't really answer that question because I'm working on documents in books which were consciously preserved there for the long haul, I would say. So the archival practices and the documents I'm looking at are still to be found in the archival settings they were put into by the respective authors. So I think that's, yeah, the big difference when you work on the initial documents as Daisy, Marina, and many others, which mostly survive in these unarchival circumstances today, which obviously doesn't mean that they've never been part of archives, as we are now slowly more and more understand. But yeah, the modern find contexts are mostly unarchival. And I think one important aspect, which Marina also talked about before, is the fact that not too long ago in history, all over the world, reuse of any material object was the rule and not the exception. And this is not only pertaining to furniture, but to everything, and including paper. And yeah, I mean, for economic reasons, for example, the reuse of paper made sense, and thus archives were rather on the shorter side of life. Yeah. Daisy.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking that the perspective from the material I've just been talking about is, in a sense, kind of, my approach might be in the opposite direction, in the sense that those collections in Cairo tend to be framed as the one exception, as exceptions because they are in an archive. But the truth is that they're in a modern archive. And so to some degree, I'm more interested in finding out what happened between the time when they were being used and how they were being used than explaining their survival to the present day seems to be in some ways not paying attention to how they were actually used at the time. So in a sense, when I look at those materials, I'm pushing back against an idea that they are actually an exceptional archive. So that's I mean, maybe it's not answering your question really, but in a sense, those, so I mean, I hinted at this before, but I think that, I mean, one of the reason that I think that particular archive survived in such large numbers is because it was formed right before the Ottoman conquest. The Ottomans came along and they had a different approach to documentary, archival practice, and also a different legal sort of court setup, and which meant that those documents kind of got frozen at a point where they resemble something that looks like, I would say, Mamluk work-related archival practice in mid-flow, but not how it was supposed to be, because I don't think that most of those documents would have been intended to be preserved long-term. Waqf documents, Waqf deeds would be an exception there. But even then, there was a practice of copying them, recopying them. So yeah, I'm not perhaps answering your question, but I think that it's this kind of trying to disentangle the material we have from a long-term, a kind of assumption that long-term is what archiving should be about. I think that's one of the things that I find most valuable when trying to disentangle some of this stuff.
Thank you, Daisy. Well, before moving to other questions I had in mind, we start to try to answer to the first two questions we received, which are quite specific. At least the first one is for Marina. Slide 22 shows different reuse decrees that the caption described as chancery decrees. However, one of them is a conspicuous consumption, massive rotulus decree that, according to your previous comments, Katim Mubayad Kazin pipeline is only valid for the Mushka, might have been rather preserved by the recipient. So how likely is it that this rotulus decree come from an Amir's household archive recipient rather than from the Chancery archive sender?
Can I share my screen to answer this question? So this is the slide that Conrad is referring to. So these are Chancery decrees in the sense that they were produced inside the Chancery, and they're half-size decrees. So they're roughly 23 centimeters across, whereas the larger size is about 45 centimeters across, and almost always those are actually split in half. But here we actually have entire lines, even if we don't have the entire decree. It's not actually easy to understand what these decrees are about, because not all of the text has been preserved. But in cases where we can reconstruct a sufficient amount of their text to actually find out who they might have been issued to, it seems that some were issued to individuals. For example, investiture documents saying you now have the right to, practice as a qadi in such and such an area or something like that. And some were issued publicly, so meant to be read aloud. I suspect that that is the case with this decree here. And then some, probably the vast majority of what we have, were actually issued to government officials. So, for example, the Chancery in Cairo would send a decree to the governor of a particular province. And that decree was meant for the consumption only of that official and the official's office. In the case of the public decrees and in the case of the decrees issued to other government officials, you can kind of see why they wouldn't be archived, because the official in question wouldn't actually have a reason to archive them, knowing that they were going to be archived elsewhere. But Conrad raises the excellent point that if you're, let's say, a qadi or some non-strictly speaking government official who's simply being given an investiture by the government, you might actually have quite a good reason to preserve your investiture decree, right? This is like an important document that's actually giving you certain rights. So for example, in this case, this is a decree bestowing titles on a qadi. And in this case, we actually have absolutely no clue how the decree, or a fragment of it, got into the hands of the Jewish scribe who reused it for some kind of, ephemeral, not very important text to do with calendar calculations. And of course, we can invent all kinds of scenarios, but that would be probably pointless. But I think that the point that Benedict raised, that we're talking about pre-industrial cultures in which things are made by hand, suggests that a lot of these objects are going to have a much greater afterlife than we might imagine. So it's entirely possible that the descendants of this Qadi ended up jettisoning the archive. But who knows, maybe they thought they could make a little bit of extra money, like from the used paper market, or something like that. In fact, the calendrical text here, we can date to the 12th century. So there wasn't a very long turnaround time between the use and the reuse. But it's going to have to be some kind of scenario like that.
Thank you, Maria, for this clarification. And I'll move to probably Esther. Yeah, we need a pause.
So I'm afraid we're coming to the end of the recorded part of the session. We'll continue to conduct the webinar, basically sort of semi-offline. But it's basically time to say goodbye to the Facebook audience and to thank the speakers we had and the chair. I mean, we'll continue to be in the webinar, but I'll officially say thank you here for the recording. Thank you for being a very good virtual audience and for the interesting questions that we'll continue to answer. So this is the last webinar of this academic year. We are finished now, and we had a really fantastic run of webinars in this channel. I hope you'll join us again for the third series of this joint Prof Institute and Society for the Medieval Mediterranean webinar series, which we will start again in October, and we'll distribute an advertisement about this very soon. All right, have a good evening, everyone, and see you very soon.